The eye of the storm, the hidden link between natural disasters and poverty. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, two residents of New Orleans experienced the same storm in dramatically different ways. One was a low-income family living in the lower Ninth Ward who didn't have a car and were unable to evacuate as floodwaters rose. They spent days stranded in dangerous conditions at the Superdome waiting for aid. Another resident living in a wealthier neighborhood evacuated early by car, stayed in a hotel out of state, and returned weeks later to begin the recovery process with insurance coverage and financial stability. They were able to restore their house and go back to their normal lives. The lower-class family could not. This contrast reflects a broader pattern documented after the disaster that was Hurricane Katrina. Statistics show that over 1,800 people died, and residents, mainly black, disproportionately lived in lower-income, flood-prone neighborhoods, making up the majority of victims. In addition, studies found that over 100,000 homes were destroyed and more than 1 million people were displaced, with low-income households facing the longest and most difficult recoveries. Many of the poorest survivors also received delayed or insufficient federal assistance, deepening existing inequality long after the storm passed. Natural disasters are often understood as unpredictable environmental events, but their impacts are deeply shaped by social and economic inequality. Scholars increasingly argue that disasters do not affect all populations equally. Instead, they unequally harm those already living in poverty. Research by Halegate and the World Development article demonstrates that poverty and natural disasters are closely connected in an intense cycle. Poor populations are more vulnerable to disasters due to where they live, the resources they lack, and their limited ability to recover. At the same time, disasters deepen poverty by destroying livelihoods, assets, and long-term opportunities. Understanding this relationship shows that natural disasters are not just environmental crises, but also major causes of global inequality. Natural disasters intensify existing inequality because structural, economic, and social systems show low-income populations in high-risk areas. They have a lower ability to evacuate and recover and reduce access to institutional aid. This results in a self-reinforcing cycle in which poverty increases disaster vulnerability and disasters further grow poverty. One of the central arguments in both articles mentioned previously is that poverty makes people significantly more vulnerable to natural disasters. Halegate explains that this vulnerability comes from three main factors: exposure, higher susceptibility to loss, and lower resilience. Poor individuals are more likely to live in high-risk areas such as floodplains or unstable urban settlements because safer land is too expensive or inaccessible. Similarly, the World Development article emphasizes that poor populations are particularly susceptible to disasters, especially in developing regions where infrastructure and protective systems are weak. This means that when disasters occur, the poor are not only more likely to be affected, but also more likely to suffer severe damage. Their homes, jobs, and communities are less protected, making smaller disasters very devastating. The flooding was so bad during Hurricane Katrina because of the collapse of the levees. The levee system in New Orleans was intended to protect the city from flooding, but during Hurricane Katrina, several levees failed, leading to the destroying of low-lying neighborhoods. Investigations later found that parts of the system, overseen by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, suffered from design flaws, weak construction, and inadequate risk planning. While the levee failures were a technical and policy failure, their consequences were not evenly distributed. Communities in lower elevation, historically marginalized areas, experienced the most severe flooding and damage. Many homes in poorer communities, much like the areas that were affected by Hurricane Katrina, do not have the same infrastructure as those that live in wealthier areas. Wealthy communities pay more for their homes because of the location and, more importantly, how the home is built. It is common to see that the houses in wealthier areas are more durable and can obtain strong winds, heavy rain, and other intense occurrences Mother Nature brings. So, the houses in poorer communities already have a disadvantage with their infrastructure. They may also lack the ability to prepare their homes for a natural disaster. When events like hurricanes happen, many people use storm shutters, flood protection, etc., in order to prepare themselves for the worst. This may not always be an option for those living in communities with a large amount of poverty because having these protections wouldn't count as a basic need for them, especially in Louisiana where the people thought the levees would hold the intense amounts of water but were sadly mistaken. In addition to increasing vulnerability, natural disasters actively cause and intensify poverty. pale gate describes a vicious circle in which disasters lead to asset loss, income shocks, and long-term economic decline. For example, households affected by disasters may lose homes, savings, or crops, leaving them unable to maintain basic consumption or invest in the future. The World Development article supports this by highlighting how disasters destroy livelihoods and create lasting economic disruption. Particularly for those without access to insurance and other financial systems, these impacts are not temporary because families may take on debt or reduce education spending that cause them to be stuck in long-term poverty. In many natural disasters, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, coordinates responses to these disasters that are extremely overwhelming to the community that was affected. During Hurricane Katrina, FEMA provided emergency shelters like the Superdome and Convention Center, coordinated search and rescue efforts with the Coast Guard, National Guard, and local agencies, and offered temporary housing assistance, food aid, and financial relief after the storm. The main problem with their aid was their delayed actions, the poor conditions of the Superdome, and the inequalities in recovery. Many people went to the Superdome to seek shelter, but the conditions made the situation much worse. There was overcrowding, loss of power and sanitation, unbearable temperatures, medical emergencies that weren't tended to, and many reports of violence and rape. The Superdome is an excellent example of how low-income and transportation-limited populations are disproportionately forced into the least safe evacuation options, highlighting how disaster vulnerability is shaped by inequality, not just weather events. FEMA's reimbursements include money for temporary housing, essential needs, and helping fix essential parts of homes. Those that apply have to have enough identification to receive aid, and someone has to go out to the scene of the disaster and determine if their home needs it or not. Their aid is capped and would not be enough to rebuild a home to its full extent. It is important to note that lower-income individuals often receive fewer resources. This is because they are more likely to give aid to those who own homes than those that are renting. Another reason is the insurance gap. Wealthier households are more likely to have flood or comprehensive insurance, which pays first. FEMA often acts as a secondary safety net, so those without insurance depend entirely on limited federal aid. Lastly, there are documentation barriers applicants must prove: identity, residence, ownership or rental status, and damage. Low-income households are more likely to lose documents during disasters or not have them readily available. This goes back into the vicious cycle. The disasters largely affecting poor folks because of location and infrastructure could cause them to lose documents that they would need to recover from a disaster just like Hurricane Katrina. It is unfair to say that natural disasters only affect those that are impoverished or facing inequalities. Disasters affect everyone equally because they are natural and unpredictable. It is the ability to be prepared that affects how certain marginalized groups react to these disasters. If they cannot afford insurance or home protection, then they are more likely to struggle in these times. Wealthier folks experience their fair share of trauma and are affected by disasters, but they are less vulnerable to the disaster when it comes because they are prepared for the worst through insurance, aid, and emergency funds. We can also say that aid systems are neutral. They help out whoever they can in times of need. However, the structural barriers that were created in the first place are what makes poor communities vulnerable to the effects of natural disasters. During Hurricane Katrina, wealthier residents were affected. They lost their homes, and some lost loved ones, but they were more likely to evacuate before landfall, often using personal vehicles and staying in hotels or with relatives outside the area where the hurricane hit. In contrast, low-income residents were far more likely to remain in the city during the disaster due to a lack of transportation, financial resources, or access to temporary housing. Even after the storm, recovery remained uneven, as those with fewer resources faced longer displacement, greater loss of property, and more difficulty accessing federal assistance. As a result, Katrina illustrates not only how natural disasters cause widespread damage, but also how existing inequalities determine who is most vulnerable and who is able to recover. Although there has been some global progress in reducing extreme poverty over the past few decades, the relationship between poverty and natural disasters has not significantly improved, and in some ways it has become worse. Today, nearly 700 million people still live in extreme poverty, and many remain highly vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks. More importantly, recent data shows that almost 80% of people living in poverty are exposed to climate-related hazards, meaning the poorest populations are still the most at risk. While disaster response systems and awareness have improved since events like Hurricane Katrina, structural inequalities such as unequal housing, limited resources, and unequal access to recovery aid continue to shape outcomes. In conclusion, natural disasters are not equalizing events, but powerful forces that reinforce existing social and economic inequalities. While hazards like hurricanes, floods, and storms are natural in origin, the level of harm they cause is shaped by structural conditions such as housing patterns, income inequality, access to transportation, and the availability of insurance and government aid. As seen in Hurricane Katrina and supported by research on disaster vulnerability, low income populations are more likely to live in high risk areas, have fewer resources to evacuate, and face greater barriers in recovery through systems like FEMA. These overlapping disadvantages create a cycle in which poverty increases exposure to disaster risk, and disasters in turn deepen and prolong poverty. Addressing this cycle requires not only improved emergency response, but also long-term policies that reduce inequality in housing, infrastructure, and access to recovery resources.